By 1807, no army in Europe could challenge Napoleon. The familiar story of his downfall points to frozen Russian steppes and coalition bayonets. But the force that actually shattered his empire was something he launched himself: a trade war against Britain that was never supposed to touch his own allies. Instead, it strangled them, smuggling exploded, economies buckled, and within 6 years the largest land empire in modern history was tearing itself apart, not from direct military defeat, but from one catastrophic economic gamble. And it all began at the very peak of Napoleon's power. Napoleon's empire stretched from the rugged coasts of Portugal to the plains of Poland, a web of power unmatched in modern Europe. After the thunder of cannons faded at Austerlitz in December 1805, the map of the continent was redrawn by his hand. The French tricolor flew over annexed departments carved from the Rhineland, northern Italy, and the Low Countries. Client kingdoms rose in Westphalia, Naples, and Poland, each ruled by a Bonaparte or loyal marshal, each bound by oath and treaty to Paris, the Confederation of the Rhine, born from the ashes of the Holy Roman Empire, unified 16 German states under French protection. Bavaria, Saxony, Württemberg, once rivals, now marched under Napoleon's command, their armies swelling the ranks of the Grande Armée. By 1807, this network controlled nearly 2.5 million square kilometers, home to more than half the population of continental Europe. The administration reached deep. French prefects enforced the Code Civil in Illyria, Montenati, and beyond. Tax collectors and conscription officers answered to Paris, not to local princes. The Kingdom of Italy, with Napoleon himself as king, funneled men and money into the imperial war machine. In the east, the Grand Duchy of Warsaw stood as a buffer against Russia, its own troops pledged to the emperor's campaigns. The victory at Austerlitz shattered Austria's resistance and forced Russia to retreat, clearing the way for this continental order. From the Atlantic to the Vistula, Napoleon's word was law, his armies unbeaten. Yet beneath this surface of absolute control, the machinery of empire was already straining against its own weight, setting the stage for a conflict that would be fought not only with guns, but with tariffs, embargoes, and the invisible weapons of economic war. Napoleon's control over Europe depended on a complex web of authority, carefully balanced between direct rule and indirect influence. In the annexed departments, places like Illyria and Montenati, French prefects answered to Paris, enforcing the Code Civil, collecting taxes, and conscripting soldiers for the Grande Armée. This centralized bureaucracy reached into daily life, from market regulations in the Low Countries to the courtrooms of northern Italy. Yet beyond these tightly managed territories, much of the empire rested on a looser structure. Client kings, often Napoleon's own relatives, sat on the thrones of Westphalia, Naples, and the Grand Duchy of Warsaw. They wore crowns, but their power depended on loyalty to the emperor and compliance with his policies. The Confederation of the Rhine, a coalition of 16 German states, owed its existence to French protection, sending troops and taxes as the price of survival. Still, even as Napoleon's word carried across the continent, there were limits to what imperial administration could achieve. Local customs, languages, and loyalties persisted beneath the surface of French law. Prefects struggled to enforce new regulations in regions where the ink on the annexation documents had barely dried. Client monarchs, faced with local unrest and economic hardship, sometimes negotiated with Paris, sometimes quietly ignored orders. The further from Paris, the more fragile the machinery of control became. Nowhere was this fragility clearer than across the Channel. Britain, shielded by the sea, remained out of reach. Its ships moved freely, its merchants traded on every coast, and its gold funded resistance from Portugal to Prussia. The imperial system, for all its reach, could not close the gap. As the bureaucracy strained and the client states chafed under French demands, Napoleon confronted a rival he could not defeat by decree or force. The island problem demanded a new kind of war, one fought not with armies, but with economic weapons. British commerce at the dawn of the 19th century was a force unlike any other on the globe. In 1805, Board of Trade records show that Britain exported over 4.2 million tons of goods, with more than half destined for continental Europe. This trade wasn't limited to luxury items or colonial curiosities. British textiles, iron, and manufactured goods poured into the ports of Hamburg, Antwerp, and Rotterdam, forming the backbone of European markets. The sheer volume of British exports dwarfed any single continental rival. For example, British textile exports alone accounted for nearly 55% of the nation's export value, far outstripping the combined output of France and its allies. Protecting this commercial lifeline was the Royal Navy, the world's largest and most professional fleet. Over 600 warships patrolled the Channel and Atlantic approaches, escorting convoys and sealing off French ports. British merchant ships, insured through Lloyd's of London, could cross oceans with relative safety. Even as French armies marched across Europe, British traders found ways to reach every major market, often under the cover of neutral flags or through intricate licensing schemes. The numbers reveal the scale of the challenge Napoleon faced. In 1806, the British government issued over 12,000 trade licenses for ships bound to neutral or colonial ports, allowing goods to be rerouted and rebranded before slipping into European hands. London's financial sector provided the credit and insurance that kept this engine running, even as war raged. For every decree Napoleon issued, British merchants found a workaround, and the flow of goods rarely stopped for long. The economic muscle of Britain was more than just ships and goods. It was a resilient, adaptable system, shielded by geography and powered by global reach. Napoleon's armies could conquer territory, but the British trade network remained stubbornly out of his grasp. British industry. At the turn of the 19th century was unlike anything else in Europe. In the textile mills of Lancashire and the ironworks of the Midlands, factory output rose year after year. By 1805, British manufacturing had reached a scale that dwarfed its continental rivals. Cotton mills powered by steam engines produced cloth faster and cheaper than any workshop in France or in the German states. Iron foundries supplied not only weapons, but rails, tools, and machinery for a world hungry for industrial goods. The numbers tell the story. Between 1800 and 1810, factory output in Britain grew by nearly 25%, with new mills opening across the North and the Midlands. But the real strength of Britain's reach lay in its supply chain. The empire's supply chain stretched from the sugar plantations of the Caribbean to the cotton fields of India and the tea warehouses of Canton. Colonial goods, raw cotton, sugar, coffee, and tobacco flowed into British ports, feeding the mills and refineries that turned them into finished products for export. These products moved out again along a web of shipping routes that circled the globe. In 1807, customs records show British imports of colonial commodities topping 60 million pounds, while exports of manufactured goods to the Americas, Africa, and Asia kept the balance of trade firmly in Britain's favor. London's merchant houses and banks financed this global network, providing credit to traders from Hamburg to Calcutta. Insurance markets at Lloyd's made it possible for ships to cross dangerous waters, while government licenses allowed British goods to slip through loopholes in continental embargoes. Even as Napoleon's armies pressed against Europe's borders, British commerce adapted, rerouting cargo through neutral ports and colonial outposts. The island's industrial engine and global supply chain proved resilient, forcing Napoleon to search for a new way to break Britain's hold on the continent. On November 21st, 1806, Napoleon, from Berlin, issued the Berlin Decree. Its terms were absolute. The British Isles were under blockade, and any vessel from Britain or its colonies was barred from French-controlled ports. The decree's language left no room for doubt. All trade in English goods is forbidden. Every article of English manufacture or coming from English colonies is declared contraband. Customs officers received orders to seize any ship, cargo, or even correspondence suspected of British origin. Confiscation was the penalty, enforced by the machinery of the imperial state. The French bureaucracy moved swiftly. The Direction Générale des Douanes in Paris sent sealed instructions to customs posts from Hamburg to Trieste. Inspectors scrutinized manifests, measured holds, and checked shipments against the Registre des Douanes. Any irregularity triggered an ordonnance de saisie, signed by the local customs commissioner. In Antwerp, ledgers from 1808 record the confiscation of 1,200 bales of English wool, each case documented and forwarded to Paris. Napoleon expanded the system with the Milan Decree on December 17, 1807. Now, any neutral ship that had touched a British port or submitted to British inspection was considered denationalized and subject to seizure. The decree's text was distributed across the Kingdom of Italy, the Confederation of the Rhine, and the Dutch and German coasts, requiring each to establish customs courts and maritime police under French definitions. Enforcement relied on paperwork. Merchants needed a letter to transport and a devise for every cargo. Missing documents or a suspicious signature meant confiscation and trial. In Hamburg, a Dutch trader was fined 30,000 francs after the Milan Decree, showing the severity. The bureaucracy's rigidity, intended to choke British trade, began to strain the empire's own system. London's financial district pulsed with activity even as imperial decrees swept across Europe. Every morning, brokers in the city gathered to trade bills of exchange, short-term credit notes that allowed merchants to buy and sell goods across borders, no matter what the law said. These slips of paper, backed by the reputations of London's merchant houses, moved money invisibly from Manchester to Hamburg, from Glasgow to Amsterdam. Even when customs officers seized British cargo in Antwerp or Rotterdam, the credit that paid for it had already changed hands in London's discount market. French inspectors could confiscate cloth or sugar, but they could not intercept a bill of exchange routed through a Danish or American bank. Insurance, too, adapted to the new risks. At Lloyd's of London, underwriters calculated the odds of a ship making it past French patrols. By 1812, the average premium for a voyage to the Baltic or the North Sea had doubled, reaching £28 per ton. Yet the volume of insured cargo kept rising. The ledgers at Lloyd's record thousands of policies issued for ships bound to neutral ports, Lisbon, Copenhagen, New York, where British goods could be offloaded, repackaged, and quietly re-exported to the continent. Every seizure or fine by French customs was factored into the cost of doing business, not a reason to stop. The mechanics of trade shifted, but the flow continued. Merchants paid higher fees for insurance and credit, but the system absorbed these costs. The continental system, designed to choke British commerce, instead gave rise to new financial instruments and insurance contracts. The law said one thing. The market found another way. For every blockade, there was a workaround, and for every risk, a price. Money, more flexible than any imperial decree, beat the ban at its own game. In the spinning mills of Lille, the effects of Napoleon's trade war were measured not in proclamations, but in empty storerooms and silent looms. Cotton prices in Paris nearly doubled between 1806 and 1808, squeezing the lifeblood from factories that once clothed the Grande Armée. Prefect reports from the spring of 1807 list 12 mills in Lille alone slashing output or shutting their doors, unable to secure raw cotton from official channels. Skilled weavers, men and women whose hands fed their families, lined up for relief, their petitions piling on the desks of administrators who could offer little more than sympathy and paperwork. Finished canvas, so essential for uniforms and tents, soared from 1.8 francs a meter to over 3.5 francs a meter in just 3 years. The blockade, meant to choke British industry, was starving the French worker instead. Yet scarcity bred ingenuity. Along the wind-lashed coasts of the North Sea, smuggling became a lifeline. The Skagerrak Strait, threading between Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, turned into a bustling corridor for contraband. British ships, barred from French ports, anchored in Danish waters and offloaded their cargo, cotton, tea, and coal onto neutral vessels. French customs registers from Dunkirk and Calais record hundreds of seizures, British linens disguised as French cloth, Manchester cotton sold in Lille at a 150% markup, and trial records of merchants like Jean-Baptiste Lamartine caught colluding with Danish captains for a cut of the profits. In 1809, customs officers in Calais reported that nearly 4 out of 5 inspected cargoes bore signs of British origin, a tacit admission that the blockade had become a game of cat and mouse. For every official decree, there was a backdoor deal, and for every shortage, a new route across gray northern waters. The machinery of state, stretched thin by war and want, could not keep pace with the hunger for British goods. The continental system, once hailed as an instrument of imperial power, was now fueling black markets and eroding the very authority it was meant to defend. In the shadow of Napoleon's armies, the real battle was being lost in the counting houses and coastal taverns, where hardship and cynicism grew side by side. On September 24, 1810, Alexander I of Russia issued a decree that shattered the illusion of continental unity. The ukaz, printed in the Imperial Gazette, reopened Russia's Baltic ports, St. Petersburg, Riga, and Revel, to foreign ships, provided their cargoes were not British. Tariffs were set at 2.5% ad valorem, with key staples like timber and hemp exempted to spur Russian exports. Customs officials received orders to issue certificates of legitimate trade, but the real message was unmistakable. Russia would no longer sacrifice its own economy for Napoleon's blockade. Trade records from Riga and St. Petersburg show the immediate impact. In 1811, the volume of imported non-British goods passing through the Baltic surged by nearly 70% compared to 1808. Russian exports of timber and hemp, vital for shipbuilding across Europe, rose by over 40%. The St. Petersburg Admiralty signed new shipbuilding contracts, while customs receipts soared. The blockade, once a pillar of Napoleon's strategy, now had a gaping hole. Alexander's decision was more than a technical adjustment. It was a public break with Paris, a declaration that Russian interests would come first. For Napoleon, this was a direct challenge, a refusal to enforce the very system that underpinned his economic war. The rupture in the blockade exposed the limits of imperial power and set in motion a confrontation that would soon move from the counting house to the battlefield. The march into Russia began with thunderous confidence. On June 24, 1812, nearly 687,000 men, the largest army Europe had ever seen, crossed the Niemen River under Napoleon's command. The Grande Armée was a mosaic of French, Poles, Germans, Italians, and Dutch, drawn from every corner of the empire and its satellites. Yet beneath the spectacle of banners and drums, the machinery of supply was already breaking down. The empire's own economic war had hollowed out its ability to sustain such a force. French depots, once stocked with grain and fodder from across the continent, now struggled to fill half-empty wagons. Only about 4,000 of the 20,000 wagons needed for the invasion could be assembled, forcing the army to rely on foraging in a land already stripped bare. The Russian army retreated, burning fields and villages behind them. Hunger and disease swept through the columns. By September, more than half the Grande Armée was gone, dead, deserted, or left behind. The winter finished. What shortages had begun? When the remnant staggered back across the Berezina in December, fewer than 100,000 returned. The economic wounds of the continental system had become a military disaster, sapping the strength of the very army meant to enforce Napoleon's will. Across Europe, the news of catastrophe spread quickly. In Berlin, Vienna, and Stockholm, old enemies sensed weakness. Prussia and Austria, once forced into uneasy alliance, joined Russia and Britain in the Sixth Coalition. By the spring of 1813, a new alliance was in the field, one that would drive the French from Germany, then from France itself. The empire, built on conquest and maintained by economic force, was now unraveling. Napoleon's trade war had set the stage for his own downfall, turning a campaign of control into a prelude to collapse. Power is rarely lost in a single battle. Sometimes it unravels from within. Today, global sanctions and trade wars shape the destinies of nations, often with unintended consequences. Napoleon's downfall reminds us that economic warfare can corrode empires more quietly than cannon fire. In the contest between force and finance, the invisible front often decides the fate of the visible. What do you think? Does history repeat itself? Share your thoughts below.